I batted back and forth in my head for a little while over whether I wanted to talk about Spider-Man Homecoming for the purposes of this marathon, since it's such a recent film and I've already talked about it at great length in at least 3 other videos, all linked in the description. Thing is, if there's one thing this video series proves, it's just how much opinions on a thing can change in not that much time. And given myself and many others touted this as the best Spider-Man movie ever made, it's only fair to revisit it now that I've reassessed how well or poorly its predecessors hold up. It'll also be good to finally give in-depth thoughts about spoilers and specific plot points in a more critical and structured manner than I get to in a spoiler cast. Homecoming had an almost unfair advantage compared to its predecessors going in, and no, it's not because a good chunk of this movie takes place on and around my birthday. Its Spider-Man had already made a small but lasting impression in Captain America: Civil War, a film which I think is far and away better than any movie Maguire or Garfield got to appear in. Said Spider-Man already had my favorite live-action version of the outfit, with the little fat version of the spider emblem, a natural explanation for the expressive eyes, and a very Steve Ditko-looking design overall. With its vibrant color palette, heightened fantastical tone, and high school setting, it looked almost like a theatrical take on Spectacular Spider-Man, which was, and still is, my favorite version of this character and his mythos. In taking place in the MCU, the movie was poised to give me the closest thing possible to what I'd always wanted but never gotten from the Spectacular iteration. To see classic Peter Parker coming into his own in a world already populated with other superheroes. This movie is a great example of how well many of the MCU movies truly do function as standalone pieces, despite the illusion that you need to be caught up with the continuity to understand each new installment. The only things you need to know about Captain America: Civil War in order to understand Spider-Man Homecoming are the parts pertaining directly to Spider-Man. And if for whatever reason you didn't watch Civil War, Homecoming opens with a handy, truncated version of Spider-Man's role in that story. Peter Parker is green to the whole superhero gig before he's thrust into a fight between the world's premier superhero team. He doesn't hardly know what's going on, but he's just excited to be there. He's gotten a taste of what it's like to fight and interact with gods amongst men, essentially, and that naturally creates some dissonance when he's dropped back down to the little leagues. As an aside, it's ironic how necessary and helpful this whole video prologue is for the purposes of this movie, since one of my minor complaints is that the parts taking place during the actual battle don't really match up with what's in Civil War at all. Combine that with Peter suddenly being a huge Star Wars fan in this movie despite not seeming to grasp the popularity of Empire Strikes Back and Civil War, and I almost have to wonder if the writers of this movie actually saw his scenes in that one. Whether or not it was the right decision to put Peter Parker in high school has been hotly debated both before and after this film's release, with the argument on one side being that most of this character's best and most classic stories only happened after he graduated, and that even if they managed to translate these kind of stories with a younger Peter, the character has been an adult for most of his publication history, and it's alienating to adult fans to have him be infantilized. I can totally understand that argument, but for a number of reasons I think it was a smart choice. For starters, it's only helpful for the longevity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that each new branded character brings something of a new voice and perspective. And while Peter Parker in the comics is often the voice of down-on-his-luck, middle-class every guys, struggling to get by with the same down-to-earth values as you or me, this universe already has that voice in the form of another bug-themed superhero named Scott Lang. And to a lesser extent Hawkeye, although he's more explicitly the ideal, benevolent, middle-American family patriarch perspective. So to avoid being redundant, I like that we lean hard onto the other defining elements of Peter's early characterization, namely that he's a scientific genius and, more importantly, a voice for the young teens who follow other superheroes but otherwise wouldn't really see themselves represented. I like that we go as far to make Peter an almost one-to-one metaphor for kids who grew up with these movies. Like certain members of the audience, Peter Parker has spent the last 8 to 10 years inundated with the exploits of Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, Black Widow, and the rest, to the point that he likely doesn't remember a time when superheroes weren't at the forefront of the popular consciousness, and the way that informs his character is a complex web that I will begin to spin shortly. Another reason I like that we stick to high school is that it finally gave us the opportunity to do a high school setting right. And I don't just mean in Spider-Man movies. Homecoming's portrayal of the general feel and environment of contemporary high school is one of the best I've seen on film, period. And I say that as someone who didn't even attend a magnet school. Granted, because this is a Marvel movie, there's only about a quarter as much arbitrary swearing and sex jokes as there would be in a real high school, but that's close enough. Seeing the world of the MCU from the perspective of the young also gives us a new view on the whole world as a setting, and how it's grown to be distinct from our own in small but noticeable ways thanks to the events of each of these films. Seeing murals and plaques in Midtown High with the likes of Howard Stark, Abraham Erskine, and Bruce Banner pictured amongst influential real-life scientists is a neat tidbit. And it's stuff like that, plus kids just casually playing F, Marry, Kill with the Avengers the way real kids do with real famous people, that show us how the Avengers and their exploits have affected the world not just technologically or politically, but socially. I also just like that keeping Peter a teenager and casting with relative age appropriateness means that the first Spider-Man movie in this new universe gets to be a formative character establishment piece without having to remotely touch on the origin again. Although, just like with Civil War, any context you might be curious about if you're unfamiliar with where Spider-Man's powers come from is briefly touched on in an exchange with his friend Ned. Mark Webb and Sam Raimi's first films were the other two movies in this franchise I consider good to great, and Peter being more kid than man is a big part of both stories. Casting as young as Holland helps Homecoming be a coming-of-age story in the way the previous first outings were, without the clearly adult actors making it so any real themes of childhood coming into adulthood have to be kind of neutered. The fact that Peter Parker is a child is very much at the center of this movie's narrative, and it's a story that hasn't really been told in a movie yet. Even a lot of the subtler, smaller bits of comedy in the film underlined how out of his depth Peter is, or at the very least that he's not quite yet cut out for the same glamorous treatment as his older idols. Tony Stark gets to step casually and gracefully out of his armor in a nice three-piece suit. Peter Parker has to spend upwards of a minute haphazardly throwing off his clothes in a dirty, rat-infested alley, the music building up to a crescendo at least twice before he finally gets the costume on. In the end, what really sells Peter's arc, and something I think somehow went over the heads of many of this film's detractors, is that by the conclusion it's explicitly not about Peter wanting to be an Avenger. I've heard it said that people find it hard to view Peter as heroic or relatable because everything he does, even into the third act, is just about impressing Stark. I guess I watched a different movie to these people, since I think it's clear Peter himself doesn't even have becoming an Avenger in mind anymore once it comes time to finally put an end to Toomes. It was established back in Civil War that Peter already has a firm grasp on the standard Spider-Man responsibility lesson, and by the end of Homecoming both the viewer and Peter himself get reminded that that philosophy is at the heart of everything he does. I recently had a back and forth with a commenter on my old video about getting away from origin, and the way you can have a character naturally develop without having to tie all of their growth to backstory, and I think this film is a perfect example of how to do that right. Like I said, this movie is about Peter's status as a child, and though the origin and responsibility lesson has been made so ubiquitous that there's no compelling way to go over it again, the movie can function as an effective origin for Peter into this universe by having him falter and relearn that lesson that defines his character. And so the movie asks, what's something that would muddy the priorities of a kid who's grown up inundated with real-life superheroes? And answers with getting to take part in one of the biggest, most fun, blowout action scenes of all time surrounded by all of his idols. Peter wanting to be a hero full-time to the point that he dismisses his education and to a lesser extent his personal relationships is, on paper, sort of admirable, but he's throwing himself all in for the wrong reasons. It's only after following that path continually endangers people and knocks him down a peg that Peter, with the opportunity to be together with the girl of his dreams, throws that away, not because being a hero just seems so fun and rewarding, but because the girl's father is going to get people hurt and no other reason. A movie that opens with a character having already learned something only to immediately stumble and have to relearn it is an unorthodox way to approach a character arc, but in execution I think it's the best arc Peter's gotten in any of these movies. Like is the case with so much of this film's comedy, all of Spider-Man's foibles and missteps throughout the film read as more than just gags or points of tension when you look at the film through this lens. Every single action scene prior to the movie's climax is punctuated by some kind of collateral damage, and the amount of people and property at risk escalates as the movie progresses. Peter gets a bodega blown up, then tears apart a good chunk of the suburb. He's really lucky no one happened to be in that treehouse, by the way, and then nearly gets all his friends killed and severely damages the Washington Monument, and finally almost drowns a ferry full of people. And yet, when it comes time to fight Toomes with his proper priorities back in place, Spidey saves the day with no one but himself any worse for wear. The message is clear. When Peter's ethos is out of whack, that's reflected in the consequences of his actions. In a similar but even more explicit fashion than the first Amazing Spider-Man, the spider suit is a major symbol in Peter's arc. It's the taking away of the suit that serves as the biggest consequence for Peter's skewed priorities. And the line from Tony about him not being worthy to have the suit if he thinks he's nothing without it echoes back in the pivotal scene where Peter's arc truly completes. Peter's buried alive by Vulture, and in a truly, viscerally uncomfortable moment, Peter is just a little kid in fear for his life, screaming for help that won't come. And then, in a downright inspired execution of the classic comics image of Peter's half-face, half-mask, Tony's words echo and Peter gathers the will to lift the rubble and continue his quest with renewed fervor. Peter in this moment, I think, truly comes of age. Through the whole movie, he's been obsessed with proving that he's not a kid, despite only wanting to do so because of values that are stuck in a very childish place. Now those values have changed, and he's being tested again. Stopping the Vulture is his responsibility now, and he earns the name Spider-Man by pushing himself to the absolute limit in the name of that responsibility, rather than the shallower desires he's held through most of the film. The line Tony gives is reminiscent of his own arc in Iron Man 3, which was all about realizing what exactly it means for Iron Man and Tony Stark to be the same person, and now he has to be the man and not just the suit. Peter learns a very similar lesson here, and in keeping with the suit or mask as a symbol, Peter's biggest blunder in the movie comes after a scene of him wearing just the spider mask in the comfort of his home, while the very last frame of the film proper is Peter in the suit but minus the mask. He's no longer covering up the fact that Peter Parker and that side of his life and moral values matters just as much as the larger-than-life, colorful, faceless superhero side. If I'm to compare Maguire, Holland, and Garfield's Spider-Man on a characterization level, I find it interesting just how much more insecure this version is in costume. Maguire and Garfield both like to play the character as someone awkward out of costume, but who could let those inhibitions go and become cocksure and strong with the mask on. In this movie, Peter is pointedly portrayed as a guy trying to be like Garfield in the suit, but is so wet behind the ears when dealing with actual criminals that he can barely keep up the facade that he knows what he's doing for more than a moment. That's potentially another cause for complaint, but it works for me. It's an aspect of the performance I expect to evolve with time, and on the level of pure acting skill, keeping me invested in the character through performance alone, I'm not comfortable putting Tom handily over Garfield, if only because the two are going for such different things, but come on. We're looking at a previously unknown actor who I'm pretty sure was 19 to 20 at the time of filming, and manages to hold his own acting against Michael Keaton and Robert Downey Jr., never once getting upstaged by either or letting the viewer forget that it's his movie, despite the fact that he has to play a kid who's out of his depth next to both of those characters. Holland has to make Peter seem both extroverted and overconfident, but also kind of meek and deferential, and he pulls it off naturally every time. Here we have maybe the prime example of how the Marvel Cinematic Universe just cannot miss in terms of casting their protagonists. Unless they're Finn Jones. But we don't talk about the Inhumans. Look, my point is, they got the absolutely best guy possible to play the version of Peter as he exists in this film. And it's enough to make you wonder if maybe Kevin Feige goes around slicing the feet off of rabbits during his off hours. If the fact that Peter is young is imperative to the story, then the fact that Vulture is old, and by extension old-fashioned, is just as important. Vulture in other mediums is usually made to look like a complete crone, utterly decrepit, versus Michael Keaton, who's not all that bad looking for a guy his age. I like that the writing compensates, making it as explicit as possible just how much age, experience, and having grown up in a completely different socio-political context has informed Adrian Toomes down to the bone. Toomes' first line in the movie is looking at his daughter's drawing of the Avengers and commenting, "When I was young, I used to draw cowboys and Indians," to which his second-in-command says, "I think the preferred term is Native American." Beyond just being a funny exchange, this opening line lets you know right off the bat that Toomes is coming from a different cultural perspective. One that makes it so, by the time the Avengers hit the scene, he doesn't have the same wide-eyed innocence that keeps Peter from acknowledging Tony Stark, or any of the Avengers, as maybe not always the best people to try and emulate, even as he literally opens the movie as ostensibly a tool in the middle of the Avengers infighting. The reveal of Toomes as Liz's father is one of those patented Marvel movie moments I've made mention of in a couple of unscripted discussion videos, wherein a shocking twist is seeded in the movie's pre-opening scene. Civil War, Guardians Volume 2, and now Black Panther all pulled the same trick, and just like those movies, this reveal got more than a few gasps out of viewing audiences. It really is a phenomenal shock moment, and it recontextualizes some earlier scenes that might have seemed like inconsistencies otherwise, like Toomes not immediately trying to kill Peter even though that's exactly what he said he'd do right before learning that Spider-Man actually saved his daughter's life in DC. This is actually a consistent trait of Toomes, and it's something that allows him to remain sympathetic even though he clearly has no problem with the principle of killing or hurting people for the sake of his big score. After a tense, extended sequence of Toomes putting together that Peter is Spider-Man, he threatens to kill Peter stone dead if Pete doesn't leave him and his business alone. Peter, of course, doesn't end up doing that, but surprisingly, Toomes doesn't seem all that angry, and tries to reason with Peter. Granted, he does try to leave him for dead after that, but once that also fails and Peter continues to be a pain, Toomes settles for beating him around for a bit, and then telling him to go home. For as much as he talks a big game, Toomes just isn't evil enough to kill a kid, and that's really interesting. Doubly interesting is that he then refuses to out Peter's identity, after Peter saves his life and makes it so he lands in prison rather than blown up into bloody grilled chunklets on the beach. I also just like that we don't have Vulture die at the end, because with the exception of the Lizard, all of these movies have ended with one of the villains dying, and it always feels like a bit of a waste. Leaving open the potential to maybe see Vulture again is exciting. He's rightfully held up as one of the best MCU villains, and in my opinion easily the best villain in any of the Spider-Man movies. While these two are actually quite different in that Toomes is one of the few MCU villains who doesn't come off as a giant child in some way, I like that he actually has something in common with Eric Killmonger in terms of execution. And I mean execution within the story, not the way that they execute people, never mind. That being that they both indirectly end up teaching a lesson to the protagonist. Just like T'Challa in Black Panther, Peter ends up adopting a benevolent version of his villain's philosophy at the end, and is forced to acknowledge how society wronged them in order to prevent another case like them cropping up in the future. The plight of Toomes as a middle-class working man is integral to Peter's change in perspective in regards to maybe kinda being an Avenger. As someone who had his livelihood indirectly threatened by those in a class above him like Stark, Toomes was exactly the kind of little guy who needed a hero like Spider-Man looking after them by staying close to the ground. Tony Stark isn't a bad or malicious person, but he was born into a place of privilege. And as one of the biggest superheroes on the planet, he's not in a position to see the effects of his actions on a micro level. He's getting better at that as time progresses, but he was especially lacking in that small picture perspective during the time of the original Avengers, where Toomes gets his start of darkness. By trying so hard to get into Tony's circle, Peter almost loses track of the small picture himself, only to realize at the end that getting his wish and becoming an Avenger would deprive the little guys of someone who can truly look out for their best interests, and in the process risk creating more vultures who feel they have to turn to crime because the system isn't looking out for them. Granted, having a superhero like Peter around doesn't come close to fixing all of the socio-economic troubles that ultimately lost Toomes his job, and allowed for Tony to make that possible, but what matters is the type of people in the MCU who needed a Spider-Man looking out for them and up until now haven't really had one, unless they happen to live in the Netflix shows. Design-wise, Vulture is a rare example of a movie design that looks great while not resembling its comic book counterpart even a little bit. The monstrously oversized wings, the sleek helmet, and the beady green eyes are all really dynamic. Even if Adrian Toomes was the most uninteresting generic personality out there, I'd still be giving this character points because of the totally radical aesthetic. He's also the first villain in a comic book movie in a long time to have a whole crew working behind him, rather than just working alone or with a single sidekick. I appreciate that both Shockers as well as the Tinkerer feel like unique and reasonable humanized characters in the small amounts of screen time they get. What exactly happens to Tinkerer and Shocker number 2 after Toomes is caught and jailed is left vague, but actors Bokeem Woodbine and Michael Chernis seem to be having a great time and play well off of Keaton. Here we've got a villain ensemble of 4 guys and all of them feel like different personalities, while, just like Peter, Toomes' presence is never overwhelmed by anyone else. As always, Tony Stark's characterization here feels like a natural build from his previous appearances, and the lessons, troubles, and growth he's had throughout other movies is informing his actions here a lot. I like that Tony's attitude toward Peter involves both overprotection and emotional distance. The audience would be forgiven for initially making the same mistake Peter did and assuming that Tony wasn't truly considering Peter or caring for what he had to say at all, just because Tony is understandably not always the best guy to give Peter the validation he needs. But the evidence to the contrary is there in all their interactions from the very start. After saving Peter from when he nearly drowned via the Vulture's accident-prone hands, he offhandedly mentions the lady who gave Peter a churro after he helped her with directions, proving that both he and Happy Hogan have actually been keeping up with Peter's exploits despite appearances, and how that same idea comes back again when Tony takes Peter's words to heart and sets up a sting operation to catch Toomes on the ferry. I occasionally see it said that Tony was wrong to punish Peter for ruining that operation, given Tony never told him about it, but I always got the implication that that was exactly what Tony was about to do when he called Peter to congratulate him just beforehand. Prior to this movie's release, it became something of a meme to cast Tony Stark as the new Uncle Ben, or to radically play up the idea that he'd be a surrogate father to Peter, and while I figured some kind of vaguely paternal relationship would be inherent in the subtext, I was honestly kind of shocked with just how hard this movie leaned into the idea of Tony consciously trying to be like a father to Peter. In their first on-screen interaction, Tony quickly says, "Peter, that's inappropriate," after making a semi-lewd joke about Aunt May, the way an adult would in front of a much younger kid when they make an off-color comment without thinking about it. In the earlier mentioned scene, Tony draws a direct parallel between his relationship with Peter and that between he and his own father, saying he'd like to break the cycle of shame as if Peter were his own son. There's even some moments in the fallout from Peter screwing up the sting on the ferry that feel just like conversations I might have had with my own dad. He suggests getting Peter into a college, and while I think some of what Tony does for Peter can play as granting shallow favors and bribes so Peter is more likely to listen to him, I think that's the cynical approach, and not giving enough credit to this character, who does tend to do everything, even the stuff that backfires horribly, out of an earnest sense of care for people. There's one thing about Tony that I seriously question, and that's when he mentions that he's got a room prepared for Peter at Avengers Facility. Is this meant to imply that Tony would have had Peter living with them away from home without even taking it up with Aunt May or Peter himself first? A surprise is a nice gesture, but had Tony not gotten lucky with Peter ultimately rejecting the offer, this whole setup comes off uncomfortably close to a kidnapping. I know that even now Tony is still a guy with some growing up to do, but that seems like it would be an egregious oversight even for Tony in Iron Man 1. I certainly don't believe Pepper would approve of it, though it's nice to have her back. If the idea is supposed to be that that room is there for more recreational purposes, or that Peter would only be staying there when he absolutely wants or needs to, then the movie doesn't convey that at all. On a similar note, almost as an extension of Tony, there's Karen, the artificial intelligence that Tony designs for the spider suit. Unlike the AIs for Tony's own suits, Karen is overly supportive and nurturing, and it makes for a really interesting dynamic if you think of her as Tony's proxy. It also speaks volumes of Peter's empathy that he almost immediately starts treating Karen like a living person, and is even the one to give her her name. A lot of people don't like Karen, or any of the major Stark upgrades that come with Peter's suit, since they think it undermines Peter's chances to prove his own intelligence and resourcefulness, but I think the movie does a good job of having Peter consistently do clever or inventive things, often coming up with ideas all on his own that Karen and the upgrades simply help execute. Just to hammer it home, the movie doubles down on Peter's quick thinking after Karen gets taken away, such as having him formulate a plan to track Toomes using his own phone deliberately left behind in Toomes' car. Not only is that, to quote Ned, a genius move, but it also goes to show just how committed Peter is to catching Toomes, as well as how cool under pressure he can actually be when it's called for, that he manages to pull that off with an actual gun to his face. Speaking of Ned, I think he's a pretty good character too, and I like that he can simultaneously be a much-needed support for Peter and something akin to a devil on his shoulder, with skewed priorities that lead to him pushing Peter to indulge in his fantasies about being an Avenger. There's the occasional moment where it seems like Ned has no perspective and isn't thinking about his friend's safety at all, but the movie is always quick to pull it back and have him show genuine empathy and gratitude where it counts. It's a fine line that's being walked here, since a lot of it is undercut with the comedy that naturally comes from the interaction between geeky teenaged boys, but when push comes to shove, I buy that Ned cares about Peter beyond just getting to experience the superhero world vicariously through him. Ned is also, I think, an interesting point of comparison for the Tinkerer, who serves a similar purpose to the Vulture as Ned does for Spider-Man. Except while Ned has the occasional good sense to call Peter out when he's making a rash decision, Tinkerer just keeps on pushing Toomes throughout the movie to make the dangerous high-altitude heist that ultimately ends in Toomes' arrest and almost gets him killed. A lot of callbacks to previous films come packaged with Happy Hogan, and I appreciate that we're keeping track of things like his insecurities over his position or his heart condition after being blown up in Iron Man 3. This is his first appearance since that movie, and it's a surprisingly welcome return. Seeing him bounce off a personality so radically different from Tony is great, and his stuff lands better for me in this movie than it did in his last outing. This might sound weird, but I wish we'd have kept in the deleted scene of Happy talking with his mom on the phone on the night of Vulture's air heist, since it would make more explicit what I think is an inherent parallel between Happy and Peter. Just like Peter, Happy has spent multiple movies now trying to prove himself useful and responsible to an authority, namely Tony, who only partly, if ever, truly trusts him to get the job done. I like the idea that in this case, Happy has to field suspicions that he doesn't know what he's doing with someone over a phone call, just like Peter constantly has to do with him. The one moment with Happy I don't like is toward the end of the movie, where we finally have him showing some genuine appreciation for Peter and establishing a real connection between the two of them before it's undercut by the joke with the kid in the bathroom. That's the one big gag moment that I felt was actively intruding on story, and I felt that way even in the theater. It's slightly alleviated by the very next scene, though, which I think is a nice contrast to the very beginning of the film. In Peter's little home video, Happy is desperate to avoid interacting with Peter more than he has to, and puts up a window between them when they're in the car together. At the end, he's driving Peter to the new Avengers facility and actively making conversation with him, even letting Peter lean over to him from the back seat. It's little details like that I think show just how much the filmmakers paid attention to making sure even the side characters tracked and were thematically relevant. On a similar kind of note, the Captain America school tapes are a hilarious running gag, but I'd also like to read into them as potentially reflecting the idea of Peter slowly losing his illusions of the Avengers as perfect. The first time he shows up, Peter joins Ned in quietly fanboying over the fact that Peter's actually met the guy. But come a later scene where pre-recorded Cap preaches that the only way to be cool is to follow the rules, and Peter leaves dismissively. The fact that that happens right after that line means almost nothing if you're not thinking about it in the context of the larger MCU, in which Steve Rogers is absolutely a guy who breaks the rules just as often as he follows them. Is this maybe Peter acknowledging some hypocrisy on Cap's part, having just gotten done fighting Cap in Civil War over an issue where Steve was emphatically the rule breaker? Another point of contention with this movie is the character of Michelle Jones. Partially because people don't like the idea of her as some kind of new take on Mary Jane Watson, what with the line about her being called MJ at the end, and partially because they just don't find her likable. I have to disagree on both counts. That's not to say that MJ isn't obnoxious. She absolutely is, but in a way that the movie is aware of and which rings true of a teenager. I'm actually open to her as a contemporary take on MJ, in part because just like my read of MJ in the first Raimi film, I think Michelle is written to be putting on a front of some kind in all of her scenes. There's something disingenuous about most of what she says and does, beyond the clear denial of an attraction to Peter, which I expect to be expanded on in future films. I also like the idea of taking MJ's usual portrayal as a girl from a broken home who compensated with a swinging, live life to the fullest party girl persona, and replacing that facade with a snarky, emotionally distant, anti-disestablishment vibe that's way more emblematic of today's disenfranchised youth. Plus, I just think she's funny. All of the supporting cast are funny, really. Almost all of Peter's decathlon team get at least one super endearing or humorous moment to themselves, and that alone does a lot to make me more interested in potential future appearances than, say, the Warriors 3 or the like. I'm not saying these guys are well-drawn three-dimensional characters, or conversely that they need more screen time in future movies, but I like to acknowledge that it felt like care was taken in giving an entertaining presence to anyone and everyone we spend the least bit of time with. One of my favorite blink-and-you'll-miss-it gags actually comes from the character of Abraham. On the way to the decathlon, all the students are ringing bells and answering test questions, and as it cuts between their answers, Flash gives one only for it to immediately cut to Abraham dinging only to say, "Flash is wrong." Flash himself is another decent example of modernizing, although I do have my issues with him. I've mentioned multiple times that the brand of bully we often portray Flash as is severely outdated, and the contemporary high school bully is far more likely to be a pretentious, verbal little snot who confuses vulgarity with wit, and is almost bound to be less popular than the people they make fun of. That said, I generally prefer takes on the character who prove to have their heart in the right place when the chips are down. Not to say we can't eventually get this version of the character to that place, but I think it's going to be a long journey from the kid who tries to pull himself out of a falling elevator with a decathlon trophy he did nothing to help win at the expense of everyone else's lives. In general, it's with Flash and Flash only that the comedy overrides human characterization, though he's not a major character, so if it had to be anyone, I guess I'm glad it's him. Seeing this movie for the first time in theaters, I had a thought that never occurred to me with any other superhero film. That being that it almost feels structured like an entire arc or run of comic book issues. I know this is technically true of most stories, but in a very particular way, Homecoming feels comprised of a lot of smaller stories that each have their own rising and falling action despite building directly on top of one another. If I were to publish a direct comic book adaptation of this movie, I could pinpoint for you exactly which scenes I would begin and end each issue on. And that's a lens I've taken to viewing a lot of superhero movies through for the fun of it. On another note of the musical variety, this is the second MCU film after Doctor Strange to be scored by Michael Giacchino, who I'm pretty sure is the only orchestrator in the franchise to work on two separate solo franchises. The guy has skill, and Homecoming appropriately doesn't sound anything like Doctor Strange, or really any other superhero movie. For lack of a better way to describe it, it's scored like a movie aimed at a younger audience, which of course it is. Peter's main fanfare isn't particularly memorable, but there are some fun variations on it throughout the movie, so the issue isn't the melody. It plays better during the low-key or quirky scenes than it does in the straight-up hero moments. Vulture's theme, by contrast, is always great. Personally, I think it's only beat out by the Killmonger theme for the best villain motif in the franchise. If absolutely nothing else is consistent about the Spider-Man movies, you're always guaranteed at least one great villain theme. I don't know if this is me reading way too much into it, and I'm not a music guy, so I can't properly articulate this, but the quality of sound here, this instrumentation almost feels like it was done by a high school band, and I appreciate that. So, even for someone with tons of admitted bias, this has been a lot of gushing. Is there anything I didn't like about this movie? Well, 8 years later doesn't work. 8 years later doesn't work at all. People have tried to make it work, I've tried to make it work, but it's not possible. There just can't be 8 years separating Avengers and Civil War without totally blowing the timeline in half, so it's just gotta be ignored. The fact that anyone working on this movie behind or in front of the camera let this time card slip by is astonishing to me. I'm not gonna harp on it, thankfully, because there isn't much to say about it beyond it just being a really dumb choice that I'm not even sure the origin of. The only massive, glaring inconsistency I can see as far as the actual plot goes is having the second Shocker ambushing Peter at the school dance, after Peter only just got out of the car with Toomes, who only just learned his identity not 5 minutes earlier. When did Toomes have time to tell Shocker Peter was Spider-Man, let him know about their conversation, and station him to wait for Pete at the back of the school? I think this might potentially be a plot hole created in the edit, since there is at least one cut scene that takes place during the dance that suggests Pete might have spent a little more time there in an earlier version of the story. As it stands, it's the biggest head-scratcher moment in the movie outside of the time card. There's an exchange that I think was ADR'd in post that tries to cover it up, where Peter asks why Shocker was sent there, only for Shocker to say, "I guess you'll never know," suggesting Shocker might be at the school for reasons unrelated to Peter, but all that honestly does is raise more questions. Outside of the fact that Vulture is her dad, Liz is a really simple and standard love interest. In keeping with the motif of age, I do like that she's older than Peter and seems to kinda have her life all figured out in a way that he doesn't. Laura Harrier gives a nice, empathetic performance, but with a story this packed, Liz is unfortunately stuck as more of a narrative device for Peter and her father, rather than an engaging love interest or individual in her own right. She's not as bad as Jane Foster, but with the rest of the cast being this good, she's the weakest link. Aunt May is also a character that feels underutilized. Because Tony fills so much of the parent role for Peter in the movie, May is left with little to do when her perspective on things is something that would have felt very appropriate. Ending the movie with her realizing Peter is Spider-Man was a genius move, and makes me hope that the next film will make better use of the character than anything in this marathon. But for right now, there are long stretches of this movie where she drops out altogether, and I honestly kind of forget she's part of the story. I mentioned at the top that this is my favorite Spidey suit design, but unfortunately I think it suffers a bit in the sense that it always looks CG in action scenes. It's bizarre because I've seen the behind the scenes, I know Holland is actually in that outfit doing stunts, but I guess they touched it up heavily in post because it takes me out of the movie fairly often. It even looks CG in the final scene with Aunt May, which makes no sense and makes me honestly think that maybe that suit just doesn't film well. The same effect is thankfully not present with the homemade spider suit Peter uses in the third act, which is another design I like despite initially bristling pretty hard against it. I tend not to like spider suits that are missing the web patterns, but the more I see of this suit in action, the more I think it actually looks pretty good. I like that it's a significantly brighter blue and red, and the ankle boots plus goggles and hoodie combo is endearingly dorky. The action scenes over the course of the movie are, I'd say, about on the same level as Amazing Spider-Man. Fun and with great use of Peter's powers, but nothing particularly stand out as far as fights go. The chase through the suburb is funny, and the fight between Spidey and Vulture on the Stark jet is actually pretty well done, especially since on a smaller screen I can actually make it out properly. I still think that whole sequence is way too visually noisy for its own good, but it's not nearly as hurtful to my eyes as it was blown up in the theater. Surprisingly though, I find Peter's race to the Washington Monument to be the sequence with the most genuine sense of tension. Overall, I do think the action is pretty good, but it's nowhere close to taking Spider-Man 2's crown as far as most memorable fights. So, when all is said and done, where do we stand? Personally, I guess you could say the Spider-Man-a-Thon has been an enlightening experience for me. My view on most of these movies has changed significantly, but Homecoming in particular resonates with me just as much, if not more, than it did seeing it for the first time. Given the frequency with which my opinions on these films has fluctuated, this may come off as a surprise to all of you or none of you, but keeping all things square, I still consider Homecoming the best Spider-Man movie so far, head and shoulders above the competition. I'm glad I took this here mammoth undertaking, and I can only hope I've helped you all watching appreciate some things about any of these movies. If I have, I wouldn't mind too much if you shared these videos around or subscribed if you haven't already. I may go on something of a little break after this. Doing so many in-depth videos so close together has kind of wreaked havoc on my voice box, and that aside, I'm genuinely kind of spent in regards to talking about superhero movies for a little while. There's likely not a force on Earth that could stop me talking about Infinity War once that comes out, but excluding that, I may just have to dedicate the channel to some other kinds of material. I wonder where I could start.